Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Tout d'abord, je tiens à vous remercier pour votre présence à la première journée de notre conférence digitale. Le deuxième jour est prévu jeudi prochain de 13 à 17h30, heure locale belge, bien sûr. Si vous n'êtes pas encore inscrit, il est encore temps de vous inscrire sur educate.be. Laissez-moi me présenter brièvement. Mon nom est Mireille van Breda, je suis coordinatrice de la plateforme educate.be. Educate est la plateforme belge pour l'éducation et la formation dans la coopération et développement. Aujourd'hui, vous participez au premier jour de la conférence digitale organisée par Educate avec l'appui d'APF, de VVOB et du département de la coopération et développement belge. La conférence a comme thème l'éducation inclusive. Elle a comme objectif de contribuer à la compréhension de ce que représente réellement l'éducation inclusive. Quels obstacles entrèvent sa réalisation? Quelles sont les perspectives? Quelles sont les stratégies, les approches pour l'atteindre? Et quelles sont les bonnes et inspirantes pratiques qui existent déjà? La durée de la conférence est de 2h30. Vers 3h, il y a une pause café qui sera prévue. Nous commencerons avec le discours d'ouverture présenté par Kirabo, suivi par une présentation du rapport mondial de l'UNESCO par Anna Dadio. Le tout sera modéré par professeur Ides Nicaise, à qui je vais bientôt donner la parole. Pendant la discussion d'experts, vous pouvez poser toutes vos questions via le chat box qui se trouve à droite sur votre écran. Nous n'aurons sans doute pas la possibilité de répondre à toutes les questions, mais nous y répondrons ultérieurement via notre site Internet. De plus, la conférence sera enregistrée. L'enregistrement ainsi que toutes les présentations et les documents des intervenants des 2 jours seront disponibles sur le site internet educate.be. Je vous souhaite à toutes et à tous une très très bonne conférence. Entre-temps, n'hésitez pas à communiquer via les réseaux sociaux en utilisant le hashtag Educate2020. Donc, le hashtag Educate2020 pour toutes les communications via les réseaux sociaux durant la conférence. Ides, à toi la parole. Bonne conférence à tous.
Thank you very much, Maria. I must say I'm delighted to be with you and to chair this first session of the conference because I'm a great fan of the Educate conferences. I have attended, I think, 7 or 8 of them in the past, together with lots of my students who benefited enormously from those conferences. I think that a few dozen of the students are also participating today. Okay, to kick off, we will have first keynote presentation by Kira Bu, who is the educational policy lead at Oxfam Ibis, which is the Danish branch of Oxfam. And she will talk about education as the great equalizer. To introduce Kira, I can say that at Oxfam, she focuses on fighting inequality in education and on the transformative role of education. She co-authored, among other things, the Oxfam report on the power of education to fight inequality. And this is an advertisement. Please download that report and read it. It's a very nice one. It documents educational inequalities and it advocates increased funding for free, quality, and public education. Kira is also a member of the board of directors of the well-known Global Partnership for Education. She has previously served as board member of the Global Campaign for Education. She has worked at Global Focus, which is a Danish coalition of civil society organizations, a bit similar to Educate, I presume. And she has been a policy advisor in the Danish Parliament and for a Danish member of the European Parliament. Kira, I'm happy to give you the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Before I start the PowerPoint, I just want to express my gratitude to Ides, to Marai, and to Educate for allowing me the honor to speak to you today. Now, I will start the PowerPoint, which means that you won't be able to see my face in a moment, but let's see if I can get this thing to work. So here we go. So let me start by why I work in this field. When I was 12, I visited a developing country for the first time. I have parents who both work in this field as well. They're in fact both teachers, but they also always had an interest in developing countries and always did work through NGOs, etc. So when it was actually the summer just before I turned 12, I went to Peru and Bolivia with my parents. And it changed my world. In Cusco, in a very touristy area of Peru, in the touristy area of Cusco, we went to dinner. And while we were having dinner, a little boy walked in, probably around my age, around 11 or 12, selling postcards. In the Peruvian winter, Cusco is blistering cold at night. We bought a few postcards, chatted a bit, he left. It was fine. Didn't think anything of it until we left the restaurant and found him sleeping in the doorway next door, under a blanket he'd been carrying and with his jacket on, very, very cold. And the unfairness of it shocked me. I would be going back to a warm hotel bed with my parents. I just had a nice meal, as much as you can eat in that altitude. He was sleeping in the street. I would be going back to school a few weeks later, back in Denmark, where I'm from, and talk about my trip. I would be asked about visiting Machu Picchu and seeing the Lake Titicaca and being up in the altitude and different languages. But the one thing that really stayed with me and has stayed with me ever since was that boy and how lucky I was to have been brought where I live, or where I was, and also to the family I was, and how unfair it was that others weren't as lucky as me. And that's basically why I do what I do, but it's also why I refuse to believe that things can't change. That little boy is still in my head now, 26 years later. So inequality is all around us. You won't pass by Oxfam without hearing about inequality. Some consider it a fact of life. In fact, this is often the argument that we meet when we say that we need to fight against inequality. Then we're told, well, you know, inequality is just part of the world. It's almost natural that there is inequality, but it isn't. Inequality is man-made. It's a function of a society that has been built over generations and over centuries and over millennia. And if it's man-made, then it can be unmade by man or by women at least. Every year, Oxfam puts out a global inequality report ahead of the World Economic Forum in Davos in end of January. And every year the numbers get worse because global inequality is growing. This number is from this year's report just before the COVID outbreak. So it feels like it was 10 years ago, but it was this year. And one of the points you can read is that the richest 22 men in the world have more wealth than all the women in Africa put together. So what are the solutions to inequality? Well, obviously, numerous things need to happen. We need a global financial system that benefits the many rather than the few. We need to pay public sector workers, including teachers, better. We need to stop rewarding inheritance of wealth. We need to build progressive tax systems, close tax loopholes, etc. But the really important thing, and what we'll talk about today, is that we need to invest in what we know fights inequality and all types of inequality better than anything else, which is quality education for all. This fights not only economic inequality, but also gender inequality, differences between opportunities, rural, urban, man, boy, rich, poor, social inequality, etc. Education really is the great equalizer. And this thing needs to move. Here we are. But obviously, education can do great things for the individual, but it can also rearrange society. It can create equality within society. It can increase the financial income, a future income of young people. It can also create a healthier population. Generally, if people are better educated, their children will be healthier, more likely to live past the age of 5, more likely to be immunized. They're more able to act on issues like climate change, etc. But education can also be where the daughter of the managing director, the CEO, meets the son of the unemployed. But that only happens if it is free, if it's public, if it's of good quality. Because if it is not of good quality, the CEO will put their child in another type of school. If it is not free, the child of the person who's unemployed will not be able to have access to that school. And obviously it needs to be public, and I'll come back to that in a moment. In a moment. In Danish, we have this expression, I don't know if it exists in any other country, so please excuse me if it doesn't, which is, it's an old horrible expression that says that equal children play the best, which is, it is so awful. In fact, well, I remember being told this my whole life. You know, it's one of those expressions that children are just taught. You know, when you're like me, the daughter of teachers, you will probably get along with children of teachers, which is, you know, perhaps not untrue, but it shouldn't be like that. In fact, we probably could put it the other way around and say the children that play together become more equal. In my public school, there were children of people who were unemployed. There were children, there was a daughter of a man who was quite famous and quite wealthy, and he was on TV. That's all I remember about him. He was on TV. I was the daughter of teachers. We were all there together. There are not that many systems in the world where people from all walks of life meet. Free public education is one of them. Free healthcare is another. And then usually when it comes to cemeteries, that's probably the third. So education really has an important role in socializing people. But obviously, this is not the type of education that is available in most countries. Not only, so education has a role to play in equalizing societies and canceling out those inequalities we see. But there's massive inequality within the education system that we really need to look at. Children that are born into rich families go to the best schools. Those schools will often be private. They will have small class sizes, well-educated teachers. They'll get a great degree from those schools. It's a privilege that those rich children inherit from their parents. These are inherited privileges, and they can grow generation by generation. However, children from poorer families, they arrive in school already behind. Their mothers might not have had adequate food while she was pregnant, meaning that their brains might not be as developed. They might not actually get to school at all. The schools will often be underfinanced or underfunded, bad facilities, maybe not even running water, access to toilets, which particularly for girls is incredibly important. There will often be too many students, teachers that are overworked and have to teach upwards of 60, 70 students at a time. Particularly children of poorer families that have other things against them, going against them, are put at risk. So these will be poor girls, poor children with disabilities, poor children from a minority or something like that, or even those that fall into several of those categories. More than half of India's poor girls get an average of 0 years of education. So often poor girls from rural areas will be the most at risk. You might think that this is just a problem in wealthy countries. It definitely isn't. If you look at my own country, you'd actually see similar situations. Massive inequalities in education system. 90% of children from rich families go through an upper secondary education in wealthy countries. only about 76% of children from poor families. So there is still a discrepancy and an inequality, I can't even say the word, even in wealthy countries. Well, so what's behind this? Well, it comes down to political choices. So last year, Oxfam produced this report that was mentioned called The Power of Education to Fight Inequality. I'm not going to plug it in as nicely as Ides did, but I will mention the report. Whenever Oxfam produces a report, we find the most devastating, hard-hitting statistic we can, and we use it in our communication. This was the one we found for our Education and Inequality report. And obviously, it's pretty devastating that in developing countries, children from rich families are 7 times more likely to complete secondary school than children from poor families. It essentially means that how well you do in school largely depends on your parents' wealth. It means that while education can fight inequality, it's almost a prerequisite for social mobility that you have access to education. But the chance that education gives individuals is not equal. The difference between the chance given to a rich boy from an urban family compared to a poor girl from a rural family, and particularly a poor girl with a disability, is massive. And as I said, it's not just about developing countries. In fact, in my own country of Denmark, the grade that children get when they leave 9th grade, which is the end of our basic education, basically correlates 1-to-1 with how wealthy their parents are. If you're upper middle class, you get 1 grade. If you're lower middle class, you get 1 grade lower on average. If your parents, and these are not you, but your parents, if your parents are working class, you get 2 grades lower. If your parents are outside of the labor market, you get 3 grades lower. It falls completely aligned. And this is in Denmark, one of the most equal countries in the world. But you know what was most devastating about this killer stat that we used? Killer stat is what we call it. It's that no one thought it was surprising. The most common response we got when we went to journalists with this statistic was, yeah, we kind of figured, what else is new? And that just breaks my heart, that it's not even a surprise, and yet we're not really acting on it. So I wanted to show you this. This is the proportion of resources going to the least educated 10%, the bottom 10%, and the most educated 10%. It's not the richest or the poorest, it's simply who's getting most education and least education. The people who do best in school cost more money. They stay in school longer. In many ways, makes perfect sense. The problem is that this doesn't just reflect the difference between getting 3 years of education and getting 10 years of education. It's not just a yearly thing. It also shows a political choice of where you invest your public money. Does it go to basic education, primary education for the masses, for all? Or does it go to tertiary education for the wealthy, or private schools for the wealthy? So in Malawi, for instance, which is at the bottom, almost 1/3 of the education budget is spent on tertiary education, despite only about 1% of the poorest actually getting a tertiary education. So this is a political choice. It's not a given. It's a political choice. The politicians in Malawi and in millions of other countries have decided to not invest where the bulk of the students go, but rather invest where the few are. Another challenge of this is private schools. I've been asked to say a few words about this. I have a lot of opinions on it. Feel free to ask questions and challenge me. When public schools fail, often due to lack of funding, the private sector has the opportunity to argue that they are the solution. I know the situation in Belgium is slightly different than in other countries, so come at me with your comments. There are even some countries that sort of allow private schools to expand without and to exist in their countries without legislation, without the framework of legislation that is necessary. some countries experiment with having private companies run parts of their education systems. We've seen this in Liberia, for instance. We are also seeing global actors like the World Bank invest masses of money in private companies running education system rather than in public, or as well as in public. So these are companies that argue that the education that they can offer is better, it's higher quality, it might be seen as international, it might be seen as cheaper, at least for the state, not for the individual. But unfortunately, the quality, to put it mildly, is uncertain. And the way the companies save money in order to get profit out will often be to save on teacher salaries. If you hire untrained teachers that are not protected by union laws and union salaries, then it's cheaper. If you run schools where you don't have to have safety regulations, there might not be rules about having access to toilet, or even that the buildings themselves are safe, then obviously it will be cheaper. These experiments with private over public have had some catastrophic results in many countries. They're very difficult to do well, and they're very easy to get wrong. Families can spend upwards of half of their monthly budget on things outside of the actual school payments, so school fees, such as uniforms, books, transportation, etc. And if you have to choose who you send to school because you can only afford to send one child, odds are you're going to choose a son. And it's not just a cultural thing of sons might do better. It's also a practical solution that in a society that is already unequal in terms of gender, having a son who might in the future be able to earn more money and help support the family that way is probably going to be more practical for the family. So in this report, Oxfam compared what countries spend on public education. We have done this for 88 countries. I've just picked some of them here, and found that what the countries spend on education per student in primary is far beyond the yearly income for each person of the poorest 10%. So this might be a bit tricky, so I'll just explain it. The blue numbers is the annual income per capita of the poorest decile. The green is the public spending per primary student. So if you can imagine in Thailand, one person earns the blue, but the state actually pays per student. So the person in blue might have 4 kids, right? The Thai state pays the green per student for primary. This shows that in almost 3/4 of the countries, of these 88 countries we looked at, the amount that the public gave was more than double of the yearly income for the poorest 10%. And in more than 25% of the countries, it was 4 times as much. So this obviously shows the power of public education, of social spending, of taxation. And it shows that no matter how much you want the private system to work, unless it is heavily controlled and funded and subsidized and structured by the state as a very minimum, it will never work for those poorest. It just won't. So the IMF has identified financing of public services as one of the most important tools that governments have to fight inequality and fight poverty. And there is evidence that they have put forward from 150 countries over 30 years, which show that investing in education and in other public services such as health reduces inequality, it creates a more equal society, and it also increases economic income for those countries. Their GDP increases more than the countries that did not do those investments in social services. Obviously, we're in a new situation now. What will the COVID crisis lead to? I think a lot of us have newfound respect for teachers after having been forced to teach children in our houses for a few months. It's tough. Teachers are superheroes. And I cannot tell you how many people have called me up, or my friends and family, and said, You know, you were right. Teachers are amazing. Let's pay them all $1 million a year because they are heroes. I basically want to throw my own kid out the window and I only have to teach one child. So hopefully it might lead to more respect for teachers. But there is a looming crisis that goes beyond school closures and beyond COVID-19, the health crisis, and beyond the school closures, which is austerity measures. We're already seeing that federal budgets, we haven't heard about state budget yet, but federal budgets in India and in Nigeria are being cut by more than 50%, 50, for education. The federal budgets for education are being cut by more than 50%. Because of austerity measures, because of the economic crisis that's already rolling out, the austerity measures are coming. So what will this lead to? Will it lead to building more resilient education systems that might be able to tackle future crises? Will it lead to this newfound respect for teachers? Or will it lead to an increase in privatization where states say, look, we're going to have to give up. We simply don't have the funding. We're going to have to hand over our schools to private companies to run instead. We don't know, but it is a massive risk and something that we all need to keep an eye out on. So lastly, I always finish every time I speak with my favorite quote. It's this one. I believe that education has an important role to play, not just in an increasing economic output and taxable income, and not just in increasing gender inequality, but rather in building the type of societies we want. Education is never neutral, and we need to not just focus on access to education, although it is important, or completion of education, although it is important. We need to constantly keep in mind what and how it is children are taught. Education, even good quality education that teaches every child to read and write, and every child completes education, every child has access to it, it can still teach children and young people to blindly follow authoritarian leaders, or to accept the status quo, accept their lot in life, accept the role that their parents had, that role will also be theirs. Or education can do the opposite. It could create active citizens, young people who challenge the world around them, who demand their rights, who fight for change, if it is done the right way. This is both about what is taught, but it is even more about how children are taught. I keep using this example that if you want a girl to learn that she is worth just as much as a boy, do you want her to learn it from a book while she is being asked to clean the blackboard and take out the trash, and only girls are asked to do that, while she is being told that her opinion in the classroom doesn't matter, only that of her male peers do? No, it's about how things are taught. If you're taught equality in the classroom, then you're much more likely to demand it from the outside world. Sometimes in this field, at least in my field, you can get jaded. You can kind of forget what you're fighting for. I spend a lot of time in brightly lit, windowless boardrooms around the world with people who have the same skin color as myself. So in my head, I always return to thinking about that boy in Cusco sleeping in the street, not going to school because he was selling postcards. He might have had a family. He might not, in fact, have had as awful a life as my 11-year-old brain turned it into. But I keep going back to him because he is who we're fighting for. It's not just about giving him an opportunity. It's about giving him a way, it's not just about giving him an opportunity to escape poverty. It's about giving him a way of fighting poverty on his own. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kira. You said you're a daughter of teachers, but you would make an excellent teacher yourself, I'm sure.
Thank you.
I learned a new term, killer statistics. I will keep it in mind, and you showed us a few excellent examples of those killer statistics, which change your mind about educational policies. And you also talked about the potential equalizing role of education, but this equalizing role is very conditional. It depends on political choices about resourcing, about the governance of education. Is public education or is it liberalized? It depends also on the implementation of policies on the class floor, we should say, how teachers are sensitized about equality of their students and how fairly they treat their students. Thank you very much for these messages. We now hand over to Anna Dadio, and I'm very proud to introduce her. She is a senior policy analyst at UNESCO, and she will present the Global Education Monitoring Report, a famous GEM report, which is the annual main publication of UNESCO. And this one deals with inclusion and education, all means all. And that's also the title, I guess, of her presentation. Anna Dadio has a PhD in econometrics. At UNESCO, she works as a senior policy analyst in the GEM report team, where she leads the thematic part of the report. Prior to this position at UNESCO, Anna worked at the OECD on issues such as aging, poverty, the intergenerational transmission of education and income, etc. In that role, she co-authored another leading publication, which I use in my courses, the publication Growing Unequal. And before joining the OECD, Anna was a researcher at several universities in Italy, Denmark, and Belgium. And I'm proud to say that we shared offices at some time at the University of Leuven. Anna, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ides, and thank you to everyone for having me here. It's a wonderful opportunity to share the messages and the key findings of the Global Education Monitoring Report of this year on inclusion and education. And for those who do not know the report, it is really the tool that has the official mandate to monitor progress of Sustainable Development Goal 4 on education. Next, please. And I will start by saying that all countries have committed to inclusive education, in a sense, when they signed up for the SDG 4 to be achieved by 2030. And this is really a commitment that we cannot afford to lose sight of. And the case for this, for achieving this, has become stronger. The GEM report referred to inclusion as a process that embraces diversity, that celebrates diversity, and builds a sense of belonging to achieve social cohesion, so more social cohesive societies. And these different actions behind that are rooted in the belief that each individual, every person, has a value and a potential. So it is not about discriminating against or about rejecting people. By contrast, it is about adapting to learners, making accommodations, and not about learners adapting to the system. As we know very well, the case for inclusion has been championed by those supporting the right of people with disabilities to ensure the right to inclusive education is guaranteed in international law with the CRPD. But inclusion is not about one group. And this is really an important message of the report. The mindset and the mechanism that generate discrimination and rejections are the same for all those excluded. And every society needs to understand and make and own up to their mechanism that exclude. Next. The GEM Report 2020 has shown that, unfortunately, still too often, identity, background, and ability still dictate education opportunity. And the discussion of the Global Education Monitoring Report about inclusion has looked both inside and outside the schools, the classroom, and the education systems. In fact, a discussion of inclusion has to start first and foremost from the 258 million of children adolescents and youth that are left out, that are completely out of school. And in 12 countries, for example, children with disabilities are 2.5 times more likely never to go to school than their peers. Adolescent refugees are 3 times more likely to be out of secondary school. And as we heard from Kira also, the world set a target for all to complete secondary school by 2030, but in at least 20 countries, not a single poor rural woman does. Among those who complete lower secondary school, the richest students are 2 times more likely to learn basic skills than the poorest. And if we look inside classrooms and schools, we know that stigma, stereotypes, and discrimination alienate other million of students, of people inside classrooms, and make them less likely to progress through education. And this is the case, for example, for LGBTI students, or even for students that are not learning in their home language. Next, please. We also heard from Kira, and we know that COVID-19 has added a new layer of complexity to these inequalities. And many online solutions to learning continuity have been inspiring, but they offer just a partial substitute for the education experience. And the uptake is really linked to the country's income. As you can see on the figure on the screen, it's the next slide, please. In primary and secondary education, they were used by about 55% of low income, 73% of lower middle income, and 93% of upper middle income countries. And this means that low and middle income countries are at far more disadvantaged starting point for an effective transition to online learning platforms. In global terms, opportunity to learn online has been the exception. Only 12% of households in the least developed countries have internet access at home. Even the low-tech solutions, such as radio, are not working. Among the poorest households in Ethiopia, for example, only 7% own a radio, and none own a television. In Burkina Faso, Burundi, and Chad, just 15% had access to electricity at home. Next slide. And this means also, another thing that is really important is that disadvantaged students have been the least likely, once again, to benefit, either because they lacked the right device, either because their internet connection was not quick enough, or because they did not have home environment that allow them to learn. In OECD, even in OECD countries, 1 in 20 students and almost 1 in 10 of those attending disadvantaged schools lack an internet connection at home. And this percentage rise to 1 in 4 in Chile, 1 in 2 in Turkey, and almost 3 in 4 in Mexico. Even in France, for example, teachers had lost contact with at least 5% of their students in the first weeks after the lockdown was announced. And based on the questionnaire from the Global Education Coalition of UNESCO, World Bank, and UNICEF, we have learned that 30% of low and lower middle income countries has taken no measure to support disadvantaged learners during the school closures. In addition, new GEM report calculation have shown that global aid is likely to decline by up to $2 billion from 2018 to 2022 as a result of the recession that is caused by COVID-19. And this poses really a serious threat to the recovery of education, to the unprecedented burden that has been caused and is caused by the pandemic. In addition, costs related to COVID-19 school closure are expected to increase the annual funding gap by a third. So education budget must be at the very least maintained, if not increased. with more flexibility in funding so that existing support can be realigned. Acting now with immediate remedial program or catch up that help these children to re-enroll or to catch up what they have missed could reduce the additional cost due to COVID by 75%. Next slide, please. Turning to the recommendation to the report, there is one that really matters for all countries and really matters for education of all education actors. The report calls on all countries to widen the understanding of inclusive education, to encompass all learners, regardless then identity, background, or ability. However, the report also shows that unfortunately, this is not the case in many countries. The report found, for example, that just 68% of countries have a definition of inclusive education, but only 57% of this definition cover multiple marginalized groups. And our recent policy paper that we launched on the World Teachers' Day also show that still too often training activities for teachers or education workforce are not taught for all learners and create further divisions. In a quarter of countries, the definition of inclusive education only covers people with a disability or special needs. It's important to understand that this report is really for everyone, and this is from where the hashtag all means all you can use really is meant for. Next slide. The report has other recommendations for governments to help them address the challenge of creating and fostering inclusive education. The first call for target financing. Inclusion is not costly by definition, and in fact, simple gestures and way to manage a classroom cost almost nothing, but they are the most valuable contribution to inclusion. Still, efforts need to be made to ensure we get equity and inclusion right through the funding policies. First of all, education ministries tend to allocate general funding equally to local authorities and schools. And second, education ministries need to think out not only their budget, but also how the budget of other ministries can help target students and families that really need and are in profound and face different forms of inequality. For example, social protection programs in Latin America have increased education attainment by up to 1.5 years. And support from international donors in this sense is also critical to allow countries to build inclusive systems. The report does recommend a twin-track approach that allocates general funding to foster an inclusive learning environment for all learners, as well as target funding to follow the furthest behind as early as possible. Next slide, please. The other recommendation of the report is really about shared expertise and resources. This is really the only way to transition to inclusion. In fact, the overall objective is to ensure that all children attend their local mainstream school and receive the support they need. And many countries are still too far from this objective. Analysis in this report of laws worldwide shows that 25% of countries still call for students with disabilities in their laws and policies to be educated in separate settings. And another 48% call for at least partial segregation in the sense that they combine multiple approach. The 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report is frank about the numerous challenges to achieve inclusion, moving from where we are now to having systems that cater for every learner's needs, including those with severe disability, is not easy. But in many ways, this is really a management challenge. A legacy on segregation means that human and material resources to support diversity have been concentrated in a few places and are unequally distributed. And mechanisms and incentives need to move specialist resources and ensure that such expertise support all mainstream schools. And in fact, and the report shows that, as our recent policy paper on teachers, on inclusive teachers also show, in several countries, resource centers, itinerant teachers, or network of educators are used to support the transition to inclusion. Right. Next slide, please. The report also calls for a close cooperation across government departments, sectors, and tiers, so that in this way it is possible to build integrated services addressing the multiple needs and multiple intersecting needs of learners. In many ways, this means that partnership becomes a key word for government to achieve inclusion. First, Education Ministry must work with other ministries to jointly identify and exchange information on the needs of disadvantaged children and their family as early as possible. This is really the basis for integrating services based on shared data and standards. And at the same time, this kind of integration of services or integration of data and information improves the quality and effectiveness of services. For example, in Colombia, 3 registries communicate with each other to identify populations who are extremely poor, internally displaced, and indigenous. And a multidimensional index estimates living standard to identify beneficiaries of social programs. However, we also know that deep-rooted norms, tradition, and the bureaucratic working cultures tend to keep service delivery in silos and apart, preventing coordination. And second, the report also suggests that education ministries need to ensure that the mandate of local governments to provide services for inclusion are fully funded and the capacity of the local officials are developed. So this means, again, more opportunities for professional developments. Often this is not the case. Next slide. The report calls for meaningful consultation with communities, parents, and students. In fact, a key barrier to inclusion in education is the lack of belief that this is possible and desirable. This lack of belief is not only a challenge for policymakers or teachers. Parents and communities may also hold discriminatory beliefs. For example, some 15% of parents in Germany and 59% in Hong Kong fear that children with disabilities disrupted other learning. But we can read about this in everyday news or tweets or other type of social media. Many parents prefer, for example, in this respect, the feeling of familiarity or exclusivity that some schools offer. School choice often exacerbates a tendency to self-segregate, something Kira was also talking about. The report refers to several examples, for instance, in Chile by income, in Denmark between natives and migrants, in Lebanon along sectarian lines, or in Malaysia by ethnicity. But it is not only a preference for being apart that can lead to separation. Parents of vulnerable children may also have genuine fears that their children are not served well in mainstream school. And so this means that schools and government should invite parents and community to voice their concerns and treat them as equals in the design of policies and programs on inclusion in education. Next, please. Another recommendation of the report concerning the application of universal design. The simple but powerful concept of universal design refers to products, environment, programs, and services made to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible, without the need of adaptation or specialized design. In education, this concept has been mainly associated with the design of school buildings and infrastructure to make them accessible for learners with disability. However, it was also later extended to describe approaches that minimize barriers to learning for learners with disability through flexible digital technologies. But this underlying idea of flexibility to overcome barriers in the interaction of learners with the education system is applicable on a much wider scale. Universal design is become then something that is crucial for fulfilling each learner potential, not just in terms of infrastructure, but also curricula and textbook. All students, and this is a powerful message of the report, should learn from the same flexible, relevant, and accessible curricula that recognize diversity and respond to the various learners' needs. And this is the case too often that curricula are not adapted to students' needs or text to exclude by perpetuating stereotypes through omission and misrepresentation. Finally, also assessment should be aligned with curriculum and textbook and be formative to allow students to demonstrate their learning in a variety of ways. Next slide, please. This recommendation is concern teacher and education first. And it's really, we know that teachers are core to education quality and to inclusion. Teachers need training on inclusion. The educational workforce should be prepared to teach all diverse students, but also feel empowered and learn in collaborative settings. Not only this is true for teachers, this is true for the whole education workforce. They all need training. For example, the report shows that ed teachers or education support personnel that full and inclusive school ethos are very beneficial to inclusion. However, we also know, for example, that around a quarter of teachers in middle and high income countries reported a high need of professional development on teaching students with special needs. Next slide, please. Teachers should not only be taught inclusive approaches as a specialist topic, but as a core element of their ongoing education. Such programs need to focus on tackling entrenched views of some students as deficient or unable to learn. And in fact, the report shows that teachers are not immune to social bias either. In the United States, 31% of teachers believed inequality was mainly due to African Americans lacking willpower to pull themselves out of poverty. And there are many examples like this. And also diversity is also needed in the teacher body. And a teacher education system that accounts for diversity from the outset, instead of taking a piecemeal approach for certain groups, allow also for a more effective use of resources. And it allows to make a shift away from categorization, which often result in stigma, marginalization, and exclusion. Across 10 Francophone sub-Saharan African countries, just 8% of grade 2 and 6 teachers had received in-service training in inclusive education. But there are examples that are shown in our last policy paper on inclusive teaching, for example, in Namibia or Ghana. Next slide. Cooperation also needs to extend to non-governmental actors who are critical partners in achieving inclusion. And this means that the government must make space for these actors to challenge and fill the gaps while making sure they are working towards the same goal of inclusions. Organization for People with Disability, Disabled People Organization, grassroots organization, and international NGOs are very active in development education and has played and still play a key role in making the case for inclusion in society. Because they are advocates and watchdogs for the right to inclusive education, but also because they provide education services very often to very disadvantaged people. And the government must provide leadership and maintain dialogue with these actors to ensure that their education services provision leads to inclusion. Lastly, the report calls for country to collect data on and for inclusion with attention and respect. This means collecting data that really allows to understand and operate where inclusion need to be fostered, and not to reduce children to label, which can really increase even more stigma and segregation. In fact, this is really a huge discussion to have, and not all children facing inclusion barriers belong to an identifiable or recognized groups. Other children belong to several groups at the same time. So there are intersecting disabilities and these intersecting needs and vulnerability that needs to be identified. A lot of progress has been done, but large discrepancies remain. Some countries do not capture even basic data. For instance, Cameroon and Nigeria had no enrollment data for children with visual impairments. And others monitor even substantive student experience, conversely. For example, New Zealand monitors whether students feel cared for, safe and secure, along with their ability to establish and maintain positive relationship, respect others' needs, and show empathy. So we see that there are a lot of differences across country in the progress they have done, they're doing to collect data. Next slide. Alongside the report, and I'm going to conclude with this, talking about this briefly, the report has also launched a new website that is Peer. And you could see the website on the screen, that is educationprofiles.org. And the peer forms a triad with the reports to other websites that are wide on education inequality and scope, which uses data visualization to compare trends over time and patterns across country on SDG 4 indicators. Next slide, please. The peer website includes a profile that is describing how every country, including yours that are listening today, approaches inclusion in education through its laws and policies. And it looks at these laws and policies in different sections that are about teachers, learning materials and curricula, governance and finance, and also for groups that are in the context of each country considered to be disadvantaged or vulnerabilities. And you will see there are 168 countries that are covered there, and there are links to the Ides countries that are profiled, that are provided by European Commission. And based on this, we have also mapped the different statistics, the different experiences of this country, and that have fed into the global report and also a background paper. And this peer are really companion to the 2020 GEM report, and the profile will be updated according to the theme of each new global education monitoring report, starting with financing profiles that will be launched in January 2021. Next, please. So I conclude here, and I ask you to really join the conversation about inclusion in education, raising awareness of this theme, and making everyone to feel that this is really a priority to get social cohesion in society and to really foster the principle of inclusion and reduce and struggle and fight against education inequality is really very important. Just a reminder, note that we have published this week also the gender review on inclusion in education, and there are forthcoming regional report on inclusion in education. The first will be launched in November, and it will be about inclusion in education in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Anna, for this very rich and comprehensive presentation. One of the novelties of SDGs compared to the Millennium Goals is that the agenda applies as much to, say, the so-called rich and advanced countries as to developing countries. And your presentation is an excellent illustration of this. I noted down a whole list of topics that are equally relevant to, say, our countries as to the developing world: desegregation, compensating differences in funding, integrated services, sharing expertise, teacher training, fighting prejudice. All these recommendations are highly relevant to any country in the world. Thank you very much. We noticed that a few participants already posted some comments in the chat box, so we are very grateful for this. We just would ask them to be a bit patient. We will deal with comments and questions after the break and indeed after the first round of presentation of our panelists. So we don't forget you, and please, I want to remind you that you have the opportunity to ask questions and make comments in the chat box, but we are now going to have a break of 5 to 10 minutes. Okay, Maria?
Oui, oui, donc merci Ides. C'est la pause, on vous permet de vous servir une tasse de thé, une tasse de café, de dégourdir vos jambes. Je vous conseille de laisser votre son allumé, comme ça vous entendez quand on reprend. Donc 10 minutes, on reprend à 15h15. À tout à l'heure.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're back on stage. Welcome back. I can smell your coffee and aromatic tea. This is the advantage of online sessions. You know, you can keep your drinks with you while participating in the session. We are now starting a panel discussion and come back to you very soon for your interventions. One of our panelists has not arrived yet. He's probably going to arrive very soon, but this does not prevent us from starting. We start with a round of presentation of the new panelists who have joined us, apart from Anna Dadio and Kira Bo. We have Miss Solange Akpo from Togo, and we have Carina Omoeva from the United States. Let me start with Solange Akpo. She is the Capacity Building Manager and Acting Regional Coordinator of ANCEFA. ANCEFA stands for the Africa Network Campaign on Education for All. Ms. Akpo studied in France at UNESCO's International Institute for Education Planning in Paris. At present, she's the Regional Coordinator and Capacity Building Manager of ANCEFA, as I said, a Pan-African network of civil society organizations active in the field of education, with 38 member states. Ms. Akpo is a lawyer and a human rights activist. She has over 15 years of experience in education policy analysis and management of development programs, campaigning and advocacy, with a focus on gender and inclusion mainly. She also represented ANCEFA in many regional and international policy fora, including the United Nations Girls' Education Initiative. And she brought a small video presentation with her, and I suggest that we start looking at this video presentation, which presents very nicely the objectives of ANCEFA. So can our technicians maybe switch on the video?
L'objectif de développement durable 4 vise à assurer l'accès de tous à une éducation de qualité sur un pied d'égalité et promouvoir les possibilités d'apprentissage tout au long de la vie. La cible 4.5 de l'ODD 4 se focalise particulièrement sur la réduction des inégalités entre les sexes et sur l'accès à l'éducation des personnes vulnérables, dont les personnes handicapées. Tous les enfants, y compris ceux handicapés, ont droit à une éducation inclusive, disponible, abordable, adaptable, accessible et de qualité. Ce droit est réitéré par l'article 24 de la Convention des Nations Unies relative aux droits des personnes handicapées ainsi que par l'article 16 du protocole à la Charte africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples relatif aux droits des personnes handicapées en Afrique. Selon les estimations, les personnes handicapées représentent environ 15% de la population mondiale. L'Afrique de l'Ouest et du Centre compte le plus grand nombre d'enfants non scolarisés au monde, avec près de 32 millions d'enfants hors du système éducatif. On estime qu'un tiers des enfants non scolarisés sont des enfants handicapés. L'éducation inclusive désigne un système éducatif qui tient compte des besoins éducatifs particuliers de tous les enfants et jeunes en situation de marginalisation et de vulnérabilité. Cela signifie que tous les enfants, quels qu'ils soient, peuvent apprendre ensemble dans une même école. Les éléments clés pour assurer une éducation inclusive sont la sensibilisation des parents et des communautés sur le droit à l'éducation pour tous les enfants et le potentiel des enfants handicapés, le renforcement de capacités des enseignants pour assurer une pédagogie adaptée à la diversité des apprenants, l'amélioration de l'accessibilité de l'environnement scolaire et la mise à disposition de matériel didactique adapté. Le système éducatif doit ainsi être transformé en priorité pour accueillir tous les enfants dans leur diversité et les éduquer ensemble dans une même école et dans une même classe en utilisant des pratiques pédagogiques inclusives. 4 ans après l'adoption des objectifs de développement durable, on peut constater que très peu de progrès ont été réalisés pour assurer l'inclusion et l'équité dans et par les systèmes et programmes éducatifs. Les gouvernements devraient honorer leurs engagements à ne laisser personne derrière eux en investissant davantage de ressources pour s'attaquer aux diverses inégalités et aux multiples désavantages auxquels sont confrontés les filles et les garçons handicapés. Pour atteindre les objectifs de développement durable d'ici 2030, il est urgent de progresser dans l'intégration des enfants handicapés dans les systèmes éducatifs existants en Afrique de l'Ouest et au-delà. Le réseau africain de la campagne pour l'éducation pour tous, ANCEFA, la Fédération ouest-africaine des associations de personnes handicapées, FOAF, et Humanité et Inclusion travaillent en synergie pour que tous les enfants, notamment les enfants handicapés, puissent avoir accès à une éducation inclusive de qualité. Faisons de l'éducation inclusive une réalité, passons de la théorie à la pratique.
Practice. Ms. Akpo, you are a lawyer and a human rights activist. Now, human rights sound like a very sullen declaration that everybody has a right to education, amongst other things, and yet it is a very tricky thing to implement in practice. You know that better than anybody else. Can you tell us how you as a lawyer see the implementation of that right and how your organization contributes to ensuring that effective right to education for all?
Merci beaucoup, Nicaise, pour la question. Merci à Educate aussi de nous donner l'opportunité en tant qu'ANCEFA de participer à cette conférence. Effectivement, l'éducation est un droit humain fondamental qui est reconnu par tous, consacré dans les textes internationaux et aussi régionaux, de même que dans les documents politiques auxquels nos États sont partis, y compris les États africains. Donc, ce droit qui est consacré fait obligation au gouvernement de garantir et de protéger le droit à l'éducation. Il doit faire en sorte qu'une éducation de qualité, équitable et inclusive soit assurée de façon obligatoire et gratuite en ne laissant personne de côté. Et cet arsenal est le fondement de la mission de ANCEFA qui a choisi de contribuer à promouvoir le droit à l'éducation, mais à travers le biais du plaidoyer. Pour ce faire, ANCEFA a organisé la société civile en coalition nationale et renforcé leur capacité à s'engager dans le dialogue sur les questions clés telles que l'accès, mais pas seulement, l'équité, la qualité, l'inclusion, mais aussi en faisant le suivi des engagements financiers que les États ont pris, parce qu'on ne peut pas assurer une éducation de qualité inclusive sans allouer suffisamment de ressources. L'un des points d'attention de notre action au niveau national est de collecter les informations par le biais de recherches sur les barrières ou les obstacles à la jouissance effective des droits, d'engager le dialogue avec les autorités éducatives nationales ou locales et d'interpeller lorsque le dialogue n'est pas possible. Lorsque l'accès, par exemple, à l'école publique est refusé à un enfant sous prétexte que les cotisations dues aux associations de parents d'élèves ne sont pas payées, ou lorsque des cours parallèles sont organisés dans l'enceinte de l'établissement et imposés aux parents contre paiement des frais, il y a manifestement un cas de violation du droit à l'éducation. Vous savez que la plupart des pays à la faveur de la promotion de l'éducation pour tous ont déclaré la gratuité de l'éducation. Mais souvent, cette gratuité est réduite aux frais scolaires et non à tout ce que ça implique d'assurer une éducation. Les retards dans la mise à disposition des manuels scolaires et autres outils à l'intention des apprenants sont aussi des freins à la qualité de l'apprentissage. La formation initiale et continue des enseignants, je crois que Anna Dadio en a parlé tout à l'heure dans sa présentation, où les enseignants ne sont pas souvent formés avant d'être dans les classes ou ne bénéficient pas de formation continue sur comment prendre en charge une classe avec une diversité d'apprenants. Et l'Afrique est la région qui compte le plus de pénuries en termes d'enseignants, allant de 70% dans le primaire jusqu'à 90% dans le secondaire. Quand on parle spécifiquement des personnes handicapées, parce que c'est vraiment l'un des points clés de notre action aussi, il faut savoir qu'en Afrique francophone, et c'est ressorti aussi dans la présentation de l'UNESCO, la plupart les établissements qui offrent une éducation inclusive sont des établissements qui donnent une éducation spécialisée. Les enfants handicapés ne sont pas intégrés dans des classes dites ouvertes à tous les autres enfants. Et souvent, l'État se contente quelquefois de donner des subventions. C'est même pas, c'est les ONG et les établissements privés qui s'occupent de cette forme d'éducation. Donc voilà des cas de violation qui se présentent dans les systèmes éducatifs, l'absence même de l'infrastructure adaptée pour la scolarisation des filles. Quand on n'a pas de toilettes séparées dans une école, quand on n'a pas accès à l'eau courante, on sait ce que ça représente comme obstacle pour la scolarisation des adolescentes au secondaire. Que dire maintenant des enfants non scolarisés qui, eux, sont carrément en dehors du système éducatif, ils sont exclus du système. Encore une fois, la région Afrique de l'Ouest et du Centre concentre un nombre important d'enfants non scolarisés, comme c'est ressorti dans la vidéo, près de 32 millions qui ne sont pas à l'école. Donc ça représente une population importante d'enfants dont le droit à l'éducation n'est pas respecté. Mais pour ce faire, nous avons choisi de ne pas aller dans la voie mener des actions juridiques, mais plutôt interpeller, faire collecter les données, produire des rapports, en discuter avec les autorités, alerter là où il faut. L'action de ANCEFA passe aussi par la sensibilisation des acteurs, parce que quelquefois, les écoles sont disponibles, mais elles ne sont pas utilisées. On a vu que dans certaines localités, il y a un rejet de l'école moderne. Comment faire en sorte que les parents puissent scolariser leurs enfants, même quand ils sont en situation de handicap, ou quand ce sont des filles, ou quand ils n'ont pas les moyens. L'analyse des politiques éducatives est aussi un volet important de notre action. Et nous sommes entrés par le triptyque planification, sensibilisation et suivi. La planification, tant que l'action n'est pas planifiée, elle n'est pas financée. Quand elle n'est pas financée, elle ne peut pas être mise en œuvre. Donc, c'est important d'avoir, par exemple, des plans sectoriels de l'éducation qui soient sensibles au genre et sensibles à l'inclusion dans les différents pays. Et nous nous sommes engagés, ANCEFA avec d'autres acteurs, pour faire en sorte que ces plans sectoriels de l'éducation puissent être influencés et puissent être sensibles au genre et sensibles à l'inclusion. Et nous menons, vous l'avez vu tout à l'heure à travers le film avec Hachi et la FOAF, un plaidoyer pour que les systèmes éducatifs en Afrique de l'Ouest et du Centre soient de plus en plus inclusifs, puisqu'on sait que l'inclusion, ce n'est pas un état, c'est une aspiration, et on va y arriver, mais on n'y est pas encore. Le plaidoyer de ANCEFA sur le plan régional et international se nourrit des actions sur le terrain qui sont menées par nos membres dans les 38 pays où nous sommes présents. Ces membres sont des coalitions nationales qui regroupent divers acteurs, les syndicats d'enseignants, les ONG actives en éducation, les médias, mais aussi les chercheurs. Et nous collaborons au niveau régional avec divers acteurs, que ce soit le département des sciences, des ressources humaines, sciences et technologies de l'Union africaine. Nous sommes membres des clusters qui ont été mis en place pour la mise en œuvre de la CESA, qui est la stratégie continentale de l'éducation pour l'Afrique. Nous collaborons avec l'UNESCO, où ANCEFA est le point focal régional de la CCONG, étant le comité consultatif des ONG auprès de l'UNESCO. Et nous sommes aussi dans le groupe de coordination pour le suivi de l'ODD 4 en Afrique de l'Ouest et du Centre. Donc, il y a des aspects de l'éducation comme la discrimination ou la privatisation de l'éducation. Je pense qu'on va y venir à à un certain moment, qui se prêtent à des actions en justice, ce que d'autres organisations de la société civile font et font bien. ANCEFA, pour sa part, a choisi la collecte des évidences, la publication des données, l'interpellation, le dialogue avec les décideurs politiques. Mais nous pensons aussi que la mise en place des mécanismes de suivi et de contrôle efficaces peuvent contribuer à rendre le droit à l'éducation effectif pour le plus grand nombre. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Ms. Akpo. Maybe one additional question. You sketched very wisely the strategy of ANCEFA. Could you say that you have had some successes, some key successes that you are proud of?
Effectivement, on peut reconnaître que ANCEFA a réussi, du moins à imposer ou négocier la présence de la société civile comme un partenaire incontournable sur les questions de l'éducation. Dans les différents pays, nous avons les groupes locaux des partenaires de l'éducation qui rassemblent les partenaires techniques et financiers, l'État, mais aussi la société civile. Et la plupart de nos membres siègent dans ces groupes-là et ils ont l'opportunité de participer à la planification, mais aussi au suivi des activités sur le terrain. Donc, je pense qu'on a beaucoup d'expérience dans ce domaine-là où, à travers l'action des membres, on a réussi à découvrir des cas où les infrastructures étaient à désirer, où peut-être les procédures de passation de marché même n'ont pas été respectées dans la construction de ces infrastructures, des cas où des livres achetés à grand renfort de financement des ressources nationales n'ont pas été distribuées à temps. Donc, je pense que nos inputs sur ce point-là sont très importants. Et aussi, il y a eu la mise en place des groupes de plaidoyer au niveau local, faire en sorte que la population à la base comprenne mieux ses droits à l'éducation et puisse les réclamer. Parce que quand on ne sait pas ce qui est prévu par l'État, on ne peut pas faire le suivi si ça a été fait ou pas. Donc, le fait déjà de sensibiliser, d'organiser les acteurs à la base, de leur dire que ça, c'est ce qui est prévu, ils sont maintenant capables de réclamer quand ça ne vient pas à temps. Quand les fournitures scolaires qui sont censées être distribuées à la rentrée arrivent à la fin du premier trimestre alors que les parents ont déjà acheté. Ça, ce sont des cas sur lesquels nous avons interpellé dans plusieurs pays et on a réussi à avoir une amélioration.
Okay, perfect illustrations actually of one of the key recommendations that were made by Anna Dadio, namely the necessity of having a democratic governance of education with participation of parents and civil society. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
I now turn to Dr. Carina Omoeva from the United States. She's Director of Research and Evaluation at the Global Education, Employment and Engagement Business Unit of FHI 360 in the United States. She oversees the research and evaluation components within FHI's programs in global education. She also leads the FHI Education Policy and Data Center, a global data and research resource on education, including, of course, educational inequalities. Dr. Omoeva, could you tell us a bit more about your organization to begin with? Because I'm not sure that in Belgium it is very well known.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ides, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity to be part of this panel. I'm very humbled by my other panelists, my speakers, and really looking forward to the discussion. It's a really important topic, equity and inclusion, that FHI 360 is committed to. You mentioned, Ides, I run the research and evaluation team at FHI 360. And FHI 360, if you're not familiar, it's a large nonprofit development organization that runs the gamut of human development, starting from a very early age, maternal and child health. We have programs in nutrition, family planning, education, early childhood development, workforce, youth support, civil society and peace building, and a big portfolio on global health. We operate in close to 60 countries. We have programs on all continents, and we have the opportunity and the honor to be working with communities in all of across the world. And in my function in research and evaluation, our job is to generate learning from the programs and to look and to try to really to distill what it is that our programs are intended to do, and distill the goals of the programs, and really hold ourselves accountable for achieving those goals and for not exacerbating and not doing any harm in the communities that we support. In fact, we strive to integrate rigorous systems from the very beginning for monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And we are committed to transparent and continuous collaborating, learning, and adapting as part of our processes. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about our initiative that we had started in 2016 along with Save the Children International that was called the Education Equity Research Initiative. Right. And that directly speaks to the topic of this conference. So I think that it's, again, just wanted to come back and say, just listening to the presentations from the very top that curated how you outlined the issues, and then Anna's, obviously this comprehensive analysis and the issue that in recommendations that the GEM report poses. It is humbling in 2020 to be talking about the issues of equity and inequality. We know that in 2020 that education systems are unequal and they often exacerbate inequality, and that would be stating the obvious. We know this, we're used to this, and as Kira said, it's disheartening. And we seek to mitigate the most egregious imbalances, but we do that through clear evidence and with data-driven programming and policymaking. So in the Education Equity Research Initiative, if you look it up, you can find the resources at educationequity2030.org. We started with a simple idea that perhaps we as FHI 360, as a big nonprofit development organization, and Save the Children International, who was our partner and co-chair in this initiative, maybe we also ought to be looking at ourselves as global development organizations, as a global development community. And we're looking at ourselves and asking ourselves the question, are we advancing the promise of public education? Are we able to say that the communities where we work are better off, not just on the average, but for the entire distribution? Are all of the children benefiting? So we gathered over 24 organizations within the umbrella of the Education Equity Research Initiative. Organizations and individuals that were committed to integrating and mainstreaming the issue of equity in all education solutions. And so for me as a researcher and as a practitioner working in this field, this really means and starts with clarity and transparency around data, evidence on poverty, ethnicity, language disparities, disability inclusion, and challenges affecting children and youth in conflict-affected settings. We were able to be struck by the disparities and gaps because we saw them. If we don't have the data, we don't have the evidence, we cannot see. And as participants in the global development community, we have to really hold ourselves accountable for producing the data, for really looking at doing the analysis that the data allows us to do, and being able to develop evidence-based solutions that address those imbalances. Within the Equity Initiative, as we call it for short, we set up several work streams and task teams focusing on key questions on equity that we were able to stimulate discussions among practitioners, advocates, and researchers. And it was difficult, and there were a lot of different perspectives brought in. And it's challenging to agree. What are the key definitions? What are the key important salient equity aspects that have to be advanced across the board? And where is contextualization important? And rather than being bogged down in definitions, we were actually able to reach agreement on key characteristics and key aspects that were important for all of this, for the entire global development community to be able to track. And those, of course, that's where we take leadership, follow the leadership of the GM report in our the global actors in the field. Things like poverty, things like language disparities, access to mother tongue education, disability inclusion, which is of course a really complex and multidimensional issue in itself. As a research community, we came into the Education Equity Research Initiative also with a plan and with an ambition to develop really specific and practical and applicable tools that every organization and every community-based organization, international organization can use to guide their work and to be able to examine to the extent that the equity and inclusion objectives are being met. We offered analytical tools that range from very simple ones that pose just a set of questions and create frameworks that really go to the heart of the issue. They ask whether or not you are observing disparity at the beginning of your program and at the end of the program. Are you really cutting the data multiple ways to be able to ensure that you're not exacerbating inequality where it started it? And in fact, we saw that when we have that blind spot, we are in fact making the situation worse in many cases. And so to our dismay, we often found that interventions that are intended to address low quality of outcomes, they often end up exacerbating inequities in outcomes if they're not designed to do that from the start. We are able to offer analytical tools that make it possible to see inequities in resource and outcomes and start tracking their progress from the very beginning through internal monitoring and evaluation. We gathered advocates for inclusive education through the Disability Inclusion Task Team, and with their support, we conducted a mapping of disability tracking tools and instruments that allow disability inclusion and disability identification to be mainstreamed. So it's not a standalone issue, but it is part and parcel of programs and policies. And now through our efforts within the Education Equity Research Initiative, and of course through efforts of so many advocates and champions of inclusive education and equity in education, this is now in reality. Disability inclusion and equity is firm within our conscience. We ask ourselves the questions that we should have been asking all along. And it's no longer enough to deliver a standard set of interventions and expect that all children will benefit from them. And of course, not everything is resolved. Many challenges remain. We know that data remain a challenge, but we are light years ahead of where we were just 5 years ago when we turned the page on the 2015 agenda in terms of acknowledging the issue and producing the relevant data. But much remains to be done. And there's always a risk that with greater production of data and evidence, and I know this as a researcher that always deals with it on a daily basis, that there's a risk of complacency, that we know this, okay, we know this as, we already addressed this because we acknowledge the issues. That means we're moving ahead, and we know that that's not true. And that data and evidence are important and crucial, and they allow us the transparency and the visibility into the issues, but they're not in themselves the answer. And I guess in conclusion, I'll just say that it's, as previous speakers have said, we have to face the fact, and as the global development community, that the imbalances and inequities in the system are there by design. They're not random. And every crisis is a turning point that makes the situation worse in terms of disparity. In fact, I'll just cite, one of the papers that we have, one of the latest papers that we've put out on the educationequity2030.org. And that is where we look at education equity as redistribution. And it is uncanny when you look at the data and you realize that the schools that serve the highest proportion of disadvantaged children are the schools that are also the least likely to receive resources, the high resources from the public education systems. If you look at the graphs and maps and 4 cases that we demonstrate in that paper, it is almost the mirror image and the map where you see the concentration of need and disadvantage versus where you see the concentration of resources in terms of teacher quality, physical environment, and instructional support resources. So these things are real, and they have to do with the distribution of resources and the financing. And you know, by highlighting our job here as in research and evidence development is to provide the information, and then to hold ourselves and others in the community and policymakers accountable to actually moving the needle in shifting that mirror image and directing resources to where they're most needed. So with that, thank you. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe to kick off the discussion, I would like to ask you how you would comment on the issue of privatization of, say, liberalization of the educational field. You live in a country where voucher schools are now flourishing, I guess, and yeah, the issue is a quite hot one. Actually, the liberalization of the school landscape in the United States is meant to equalize opportunities, if I understand correctly. What's your opinion, and how does this transfer to other countries? Do you have an opinion on that key issue that was also discussed by Kira Bo?
Oh, thank you, Des. It's such a complex question, and I, of course, will be looking forward to what my other panelists will comment. And here is just me, Carina, speaking for myself. You know, it's not the position of FHI 360. And yes, you're right. I mean, in the United States, the issue of privatization is directly relevant to the issue of equity in education. And in fact, I think Kira already mentioned that the challenge with having 2 separate systems is that the people with the means, the advantages, and the wealthy are not bought into the system of public education. And if they're not bought into the system of public education, they're not committed to it. They don't bring resources. They bring their social capital. They don't bring their financial resources. They don't bring their commitment into the public education system that further exacerbates and puts their children on different tracks. And that really goes to the heart of the issue in many, many districts in the United States. And you know, it's a very, very decentralized system. And there are many, you know, of course, debates and I'm sure multiple different positions about how potentially private solutions might address issues in the public education sphere. You mentioned vouchers and charter schools, for example, and that is a solution that stems from a belief that the individual can make choices that are rational and that would overall benefit the society. And those choices have been shown, and those the beliefs and those that ideology has been shown to not really bear out in empirical evidence. So we have a very you know, a lot of issues rooted in the ideology. And unfortunately, that drives resources out of the public education systems and away from equity.
All right. So basically, if I understand correctly, you share the pledge of Kira Bo for a strong public education system per se, without liberalizing too much. Okay, thank you. I don't know if anybody from the audience wants to comment on this. I think the world is very diverse, and we have situations where public education doesn't do very well. There's Anna, did you want to? Yes, you have the floor.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say a few words about that. First of all, because it will be the theme of our next Global Education Monitoring Report 21-22. It's a very important and complex topic. Too often, the understanding of private actors is very limited. So the first question is, what are non-state actors and how they have been brought into the landscape? So the historical perspective on this is very important because each country has, of course, a different perspective and a different position about that. Of course, public education is, and we said in our 2017-18 report on accountability that the government and the state should be the primary duty bearer of the right to education. But there are many situations that make this very complex: lack of resources, ideology, or historical trends. So what I want to say is that exactly for this reason, I hope that to get you all on board to read and really be ready for our next report, because it will really try to give a perspective on all these different issues, but also looking inside regulations, for example, which is a very important issues. Why in many countries that are still many unrecognized schools that are private, that are non-state, and that still there to operate and to deliver education, why in a landscape where there is a SDG 4 for equality, universal and inclusive education, still too many are not only left out of the system, but are included in low quality system that very often are low fee or affordability schools. So there is a lot huge problematic. The issue of governance, of regulation or innovation in this field are huge. The issue of teachers working in private and public school. And as I was saying at the beginning, the fundamental issue is also who are and how we can define these non-state actors. And in fact, the report will be on non-state actors in education and not on private education alone.
Okay, that's an important qualification, I would say. I guess that many of our participants are themselves involved in so-called private but non-profit initiatives in education in the South, and they would claim that they are serving disadvantaged populations in the first place. So there's a need for a very balanced discussion here. Kira, I know that you have to leave us very soon. Oh, you're okay. But yeah, speaking further on this topic, would you like to react to the statements on this point?
Yeah. And I don't have to leave because I'm stuck in my house because I had to take a COVID test. So I'm not allowed to leave my house for 48 hours. So you're not getting rid of me because you are my only entertainment this afternoon. No, I do think what Anna said is really important. There is a difference between private and private, or non-state and non-state, and we often sort of mix up for-profit, not-for-profit, private entities, others, not state actors, and it's sort of it's a bit of a puzzle. So I sit on the board of the Global Partnership for Education, which last June decided to not allow any money to flow through for-profit provision of education. Part of the challenge there was to map out all the actors that are in education. So for instance, private companies that provide textbooks or provide cleaning services or lunch services or whatever, are they a problem? I don't know. I wouldn't think that they necessarily are. I think what it came down to was, where do we need very strong state controls, state governance systems, and then specifically on private for-profit provision. That's the differentiation that the Global Partnership for Education made, but it was not an easy process. It's an incredibly difficult topic. I will say just a couple of other things, if I may. One is, if you look at two countries like Denmark and Sweden, which are very similar in many, many ways, Sweden has a rule that says no public money can flow to private education. Denmark has a rule that says you're not allowed to make profit off of providing education. Those are two very different rules, and they've created two completely different systems. In Sweden, there are for-profit schools that service the wealthiest. It means that the wealthiest have a completely separate system where you can create profit of the education, but also there is no public money that flows into those schools, which means you have to be truly wealthy to afford to send your children there. Whereas Denmark has a large proportion of private schools, you're not allowed to create profit off of them, and the majority of the funding comes from the state. So about 76% of the cost of a child going to private school in Denmark is funded by the state. These are two completely different systems. I have a lot of respect for the Swedish position. I think it helps me greatly internationally that Sweden can say we refuse to fund anything related to for-profit. Anything related to private schools. However, if you look at what it does to inequality, the Swedish system in many ways is worse than the Danish, despite the fact that a lot of Danish money for education flows into a private sector. But because you're not allowed to create profit there are still ways to do it. I mean, I'm sort of talking about an idealized world, but this complete separation between the wealthiest and the rest in Sweden, you do not have in Denmark. At the same time, though, I will say that even though 76% of private schools in Denmark is funded by the state, the parents who choose to send their children to private school in Denmark are not Mr. and Mrs. Working in a grocery store or whatever. They tend to be better educated parents with more sort of social capital to go around, willing and able to make that informed choice about what education they want for their child. And this also means that all the rest end up in the public school. It means that the quality of the public schools are going down and the quality of the private schools are sort of staying the same or going up. This is a massive problem when it comes to inequality, but it's also a huge problem for the public schools. It's sort of a minor version of what's happening in the States, where if a lot of money ends up flowing to the private schools, but the public schools still take the bulk of the students with challenges, whether those are minor learning disabilities or social challenges, or they come from homes with parents who cannot read or write, or who have social challenges or whatever, more money, in fact, needs to go into those public schools in order to help support those children. And that isn't happening. So I know I might be a bit of an extremist on this. My personal view is I don't think any private provision of education will not in the end up harming education, inequality within education. This is my position. I'm not sure it's actually Oxfam's position, so it's just my personal position. I have yet to see a system where there's public money flowing into private education where it doesn't harm inequality. And I've yet to see a system where private rich people can I'm using the word private too many, where rich people can pay for private education completely separate from the public system, where that doesn't harm inequality in society at large. So my personal position is, when we talk about inequality and about inclusion and cohesion in society, any kind of private provision is a problem.
Okay, thank you. I must say I share a lot of your ideas, and what is most interesting, this is popping up increasingly in the whole SDG debate. You cannot disconnect the position of the most vulnerable groups from the position of the most powerful groups. And if the most powerful group desegregate themselves or segregate themselves from, say, mainstream society, that has tremendous indirect effects on the rest of society, including the most vulnerable. So this is definitely something we need to bear in mind. I see that time is running very fast, and there is another topic which I think is very hot and which was put forward by Nadia Haddad from the audience, and that is the issue of how you deal with disabled children in education, how you do it best. in practical circumstances that may be very diverse. The question is very simple. Should disabled children be in mainstream schools or in special schools? I'm sure there's a lot of principal ideas about it. I want also to have some comments in practical terms. Who wants to comment on this point? Including people from the audience. I see a little movement in the chat flow. I don't know, Maria, am I missing part of the chat flow?
No, it's okay. It was the question of Nadia Haddad.
Yes.
She is from, she's a member of the Executive Committee of the European Disability Forum. And she asked, what about children with disabilities in regular or special schools? And are there any data to compare with children without disabilities? So we are talking about data. And then she said, why not go to court to change the situation and not to depend on the goodwill of the interpretation of reasonable accommodation of school directors? A right-based approach. That's what she's asking.
I can start if you want.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
But I think it's a really important question, and in fact, if you can say it, the Global Education Monitoring Report of this year has looked through the different things that have happened over time, and the main issue here is really the change in the approaches. So we know very well that over time we have moved from an approach where children and adults, students in general, learners with disability were completely excluded or left to the care, I would say, not the education of other organizations, very often faith schools or institutions that cared for their needs. So over time, there has been this change that has moved from the medical approach to disability to the social approach to disability. So seeing not a disability like an illness, something that so the person with a disability is in school, but he or she has to adapt to the school, but something that really goes well beyond that. It is a characteristic of the system. The person with disability is not a diverse person, and this is the system that needs to adapt to the person. This is really, there have been examples and huge literature about how really a simple impairments can become a disability. For example, even for the sight problem. So if you think at a school or a country where children do not have glasses to see their books or the whiteboards, this becomes impossible for them to learn. Even a simple disability or a simple impairments, which is different, become an obstacle to learn. So this is the fact that in that sense, it's really the system that needs to own the mechanism that exclude, as I was saying in my presentation, and make sure that each learner has the possibility to learn. So then there has been also different ways to face and to challenge the issue of mainstream or education in mainstream school or in special school. I think that the CRPD, so the Convention of the Rights for People with Disability, has been great and also the Conference on Special Education '94 by UNESCO has really put a foothold on the issue of inclusion and the discussion of the needs of people with disabilities. And the definition of right to inclusive education by the CRPD in 2016 has been really something that has been gone beyond all this and has determined and set aside a right to people with disability to be educated in the same mainstream scheme. However, it was not an obligation. So that's important. There was, if you read the report, there is a discussion about the tension that have arisen during the writing of the drafting of the Article 24 on the right to inclusive education about the idea of educating children under the same roof or making them learning really. And this is debate that's still going on. So the point is that what we mean by inclusive education, do we mean placing children simply under the same roof or and this goes beyond the children with disabilities, because we know that in some countries there are policies of two different ethnic groups that are educated under the same roof with different schools, and this is one case. But it's also the case of whether the system is made to address their diverse learning needs. So in fact, there is not a yes or no. There is a situation that allows to say that it's very important that we address this as a process. So in theory, and the ambition is that every child goes to the same mainstream school. And this needs the participation of all actors to make this possible. I was talking before about teachers. Teachers very often do not feel prepared to address the needs of their children with disability inside. And parents may fear the fact that the resources are not adapted. And that's why the fact that there are collaborative settings for teachers to learn, and communities and parents can voice their concern, may really make a huge help in this. And we have shown in the report that unfortunately, too much often, it's still the case that there are, even in policies or laws, the segregation of people, of students with disabilities is really covered in the laws and the policies. And the move of the CRPD in very recent years, I would say on the report of the country report, for example, on Spain, has made clear more and more that it's not the mainstream of people with disabilities should be a solution, should be really the rule. And so that's why, going back to your question, I think the idea, and this is what we want with this kind of conferences and debates, is to foster the idea that inclusive education is the ambition, is really what we need to get a quality education. But this requires really a huge effort by all actors, by teachers, parents, policymakers. We ourselves, we have to push the idea of inclusive education.
Right, thank you very much. I fully agree to your point, and I'm in a way, I'm reassured that this is not an ideological standpoint. It is an agenda, a policy agenda for the long term, I would say. As you say, the ambition is there, and it should be there for every single child. But it is definitely a demanding agenda. And we need to fulfill all necessary conditions in terms of teacher training, in terms of sensitization, material investments, and so on, to achieve a genuine inclusive education. It's not an easy point. And one of the people from the audience emphasized that this does not apply only to people with disabilities, but also to other groups of students, of course. Mm-hmm. Universal design is the answer to this. I would like to ask Ms. Akpo and Ms. Omoeva what they think on this issue, and in terms of their experience from Africa, from the countries where you are engaged. Solange, will you go first?
Yes. Si je peux commencer, je voudrais dire que effectivement, nous partageons le point de vue de Madame Anadadio sur la question. C'est vrai que l'éducation inclusive, c'est notre aspiration profonde, mais ça ne peut pas se faire du jour au lendemain. Il faudrait qu'on commence le processus. Et je voudrais faire le parallèle avec les écoles publiques. À partir du moment où les classes moyennes ont déserté d'envoyer leurs enfants dans les écoles publiques, on a vu que la qualité de ces écoles a baissé. Parce que ce sont les classes moyennes qui ont la capacité de réclamer leurs droits, à un certain niveau, peuvent réclamer leurs droits. Donc, de la même façon, si on attend que tout soit parfait avant qu'on ne puisse intégrer les enfants handicapés dans les écoles publiques ou les écoles ouvertes à tous, ça veut dire que ça ne va pas se faire. C'est le fait qu'il y ait le besoin va créer les investissements. Mm-hmm. Si on ne crée pas le besoin, il n'y aura pas d'investissement. Donc, c'est cela. Ce qu'on a vu, si je prends le cas de l'Afrique, on s'est dit que les écoles publiques ne donnent pas une éducation de qualité. Et qu'est-ce que les parents ont fait? La plupart des parents, on va dans les écoles privées, tous ceux qui peuvent se permettre de scolariser leurs enfants dans des écoles privées de bonne qualité, ils envoient leurs enfants là. Mais l'effet induit, c'est que les investissements dans les écoles publiques ne sont plus à la hauteur. Et il n'y a pas cette pression-là pour exiger que ces investissements publics continuent. Donc, il faudrait qu'on commence quelque part pour créer les conditions de cette éducation inclusive ouverte à tous, et pas seulement les enfants handicapés, les enfants des classes moyennes, les enfants, les minorités, les personnes vulnérables, les déplacés. Et là, on aura une situation où l'école est véritablement inclusive, où les enseignants sont formés pour prendre en charge des classes avec des populations diverses et que le financement suive.
Thank you very much. And also a very interesting point. Over to Carina.
Thank you, Des. I mean, I don't have a lot to add. I think that Anna really covered the issue comprehensively, and Solange did as well. From our point of view, I mean, we completely subscribe to the position that the vast majority of children with disabilities should be integrated in mainstream schools. And it is a matter of the school and the school environment meeting the child where the child is and providing the resources and the instruction that the child needs to succeed. And again, you know, as Anna said, the disability inclusion, it's not about child that is disabled and that is their problem. It's the problem of the environment not meeting the child or where their needs are. And through our programs in education, we are exploring ways to equip teachers and provide them with the resources to be able to first identify and see children with different needs, and then be able to provide them with the instructional support that they need. But that is, you know, that is a really complex issue. What do the teachers need? What resources do they need to be able to see them? If a teacher is dealing with a classroom of 100 children and more, and, you know, it's really not realistic for her to be able to devote additional attention to every child, especially a child who has special needs. And so it's a question that sometimes is very basic, question of, as Solange said, question of the classroom size and the quality of the education as a whole. But then it's also a question of what are do teachers have the resources that they need? And do teachers have the support that they need? And are there additional trained personnel to support them and to provide the intervention when it's needed for children with special needs? And so it is, you know, I think, as I said, it's really encouraging that we are talking about these issues, that it is now, the issues are in the mainstream, that every organization is asking itself these questions. And most donors, multilateral donors, are putting disability inclusion as a priority, which means that the resources are going to start flowing. And to the question of data, we're finally going to have to see some data on how our children with disabilities are actually being integrated, benefiting from education. Right now, it's a blind spot. We don't have a lot of data. It's very high level on the country level. But we know already from even that it is a massive predictor of you know, not achieving educational goals, not being included not being able to achieve marks and attain the same levels of education as children that don't have disabilities. So it's a long road ahead of us, and there are some really clear pathways, and it's often a question of political will and a question of resources.
Thank you, Carina. I'm looking at Marije. Marije, it's frustrating to see how the time is running out. Is there any remaining burning question or statement from the audience that you want to put forward?
Oui, Ides, il y a encore une question de Audace du Burundi, qui est au Burundi, qui dit, à côté de tous ces problèmes évoqués, qu'en est-il pour les enfants qui ne sont pas inscrits à l'état civil? Donc, le manque d'enregistrement de naissance qui pose problème pour s'inscrire à l'école par après. Donc, en bref, sa question en résumé. Donc, des milliers d'enfants ne peuvent pas avoir des extraits d'actes de naissance, soit des enfants issus de familles pauvres, soit des enfants repatriés. Et puis, de plus, il est difficile de parler de l'éducation inclusive quand on rencontre l'insuffisance d'infrastructures scolaires, le manque de bancs de livres scolaires où l'enseignant doit s'occuper d'une grosse classe.
Okay.
Groupe d'élèves.
I suggest that one of the speakers takes this on board, and then we definitely have to wrap up. Sorry. Yeah. Who wants to answer this question? Undocumented, unregistered children. Anna.
Again.
No. Can you keep it brief?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I would just say that this is a burning problem, and it's really the issue that we considered last year in the Global Education Monitoring Report on migration, displacement, and education, for example, but is for refugees or undocumented migrants, especially minor, arriving even in Italy, France, Germany, in these OECD countries, and they cannot enroll to school. And there are some good practices by countries, for example, especially when the schools have this kind of inclusive ethos, and so they don't block the boarding gates of schools to make children excluded from their schools. There is something that we said last year that is important also in this case, especially for migrants, is to have clear policies, clear legislation, clear information about how to surmount this problem. This is not just a problem for migrants, refugees. This is an issue of many people of descent in African countries, but also in Haiti, for example, on many other countries that have this impossibility. So for there are concrete solutions or cases that are explained that are presented in the monitoring report, because I need to be brief about that. But it's something that implies also that there is no one single factor that excludes. We have talked about disabilities, but there is ethnics, there is ethnicity, indigenous people are left out of school. We didn't talk at all about sexual orientation or gender identities. We didn't talk about LGBTI students. We didn't talk about girls that are pregnant or married or forced to be married at early ages. All the, or child labors. All these are really burning questions for exclusion that accompany. So I would say again, and what the report has highlighted, widen the understanding of inclusion. Really think that every those that are at risk of being left behind need to be prioritized by our education system. And one way to do this is also to think about the education budgets, really the education budget and financing.
Thank you. I would also like, before closing the session, the 2 or 3 other speakers maybe to make a last statement. I think you may have some burning issues that you want to touch upon and that were not dealt with yet. Solange.
Merci beaucoup, Ides. Je voudrais dire que, pour rebondir sur la dernière partie de la soumission de Anna, nous avons les cas d'exclusion, surtout dans les pays sous-développés et en Afrique, sont nombreux. Les exclusions revêtent différentes formes et la question de la jeune fille avec les mariages précoces et les grossesses précoces aussi génèrent des cas d'exclusion du système scolaire. Et à la faveur de la pandémie, nous avons vu une augmentation drastique des cas de grossesse précoce qui va générer aussi des exclusions à la reprise des classes. Et comment nous allons gérer cette situation? Je pense qu'il faut vraiment des interventions ciblées, des campagnes pour faire en sorte que ces filles qui vont être peut-être se retrouver en dehors du système à un moment donné, puissent retourner à l'école après avoir donné naissance, si elles arrivent jusqu'à cette étape, parce que même là, avec les cas de grossesse précoce, c'est un danger pour la vie de la fille et pour la suite de sa scolarité. Il nous faut des campagnes ciblées. Il faut aussi sensibiliser les acteurs pour que les enseignants aussi puissent prendre en charge tous ces cas de violence que les enfants ont subis pendant la pandémie. Et les enseignants eux-mêmes, il faut qu'ils soient en mesure de pouvoir accommoder les enfants après. Eux aussi ont été l'objet de beaucoup de stress. Donc, le trauma lié à la pandémie, il faudrait qu'on gère cela. Les cas d'exclusion sont nombreux. On a besoin de l'effort de tous. Donc, il faut que nous mettions tous en mouvement pour faire en sorte que l'éducation soit vraiment inclusive et équitable. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Carina?
No, thank you very much, Des and Educate, for this wonderful opportunity. Just to say as me as a researcher, I would be remiss if I didn't put the last plug for data and evidence and analysis, especially as we move through this really difficult set of issues and solutions are not always obvious, and we're looking for ways to generate a political will and generate demand for change. That's where data and kits can be really, really powerful. So if there's students among you, I encourage you to really get in there and study on data and statistics. And the researchers, of course, there's a long road to generate a common knowledge base for how to advance inclusive education. So stay on it. Thank you.
Thanks. And the last word is for Kira.
I get both the first and the last word. I'm very privileged. Thank you so much, and I'm particularly happy that Solange mentioned this issue around teenage pregnancies and not returning to school and how the pandemic might influence that. It is a huge issue, and rather than, I mean, there's obviously something we can do to avoid teenage pregnancies, but there are also legislation that can be changed so that girls are allowed back in school. It happened in Sierra Leone just a few months ago. They say that it was because of, you know, they knew what happened after their last epidemic, but also they were pushed by the ECOWAS court of human rights to change the legislation. But it can happen in other countries, and I think this comes back to my first point, which will also be my last point, which is that this is a choice. It's not a given that there are changes that can be made in terms of policy, in terms of what we can advocate for, in terms of where funding goes, that can fundamentally change education systems. Obviously, those in power will have an interest in seeing that the overall power structures stay the same. An educated population is risky for people in power. That's just how it is. Revolutions tend to come from students. Students are terrifying for people in power. They have which is why we love students. So there are things that can change, and we can help make them change. So I think I don't want people to go away thinking, oh, everything's horrible, but rather go away and think, hey, we can actually do something to change this. There's something you can do tomorrow in your own country as well as in countries around the world. And every little change helps the larger picture. And countries learn from each other. Global institutions learn from each other. So if you change one thing, you will probably see it snowball. Thanks.
Well, before handing over back to Maria, I would first of all like to thank all the panelists for their wonderful contributions. I think this was a very rich discussion. I apologize to the participants who submitted some last minute comments or questions and whose comments have not been dealt with. We certainly keep them on board and deal with them afterwards, as Maria promised. Let me just say on my side what I learned this afternoon. I learned several things, mainly two. One is that there is none of the issues that relate to, say, developing countries that is not present in the rich world. We discussed, for example, in the last minutes, the situation of teenage pregnancy and teen mothers who are excluded from school or dropping out early themselves. This happens in Europe. This happens in Belgium. And we even have children that are not registered, not to forget the Roma children, for example, a serious problem in Central and Eastern Europe. So the problems are universal. And there are obviously differences in size of the problems, but we all need to deal with them. That's my first lesson. The second lesson is that we cannot disconnect the issue of inclusion of vulnerable groups without addressing the issue of solidarity of other groups in society. Suppose you enroll a child with a disability in a certain class and other parents decide to withdraw their children and to move them to another school, then you have another situation of segregation and of discrimination. So it's a common responsibility of all parents, of all actors in society. Those are, for me, the two main lessons across all the different dimensions that were discussed. And maybe I forget a lot of details, but we need to stop here. Thank you also to Mare in the first place for organizing this conference. I think it was a very enriching one, and we look forward to the second part. But now I hand over to you.
Merci Ides. Tout d'abord, un grand merci à Ides pour la modération. Un tout grand merci à Anna, Solange, Kira et Carina pour votre temps, pour vos idées, pour votre inspiration, pour votre présence aujourd'hui avec nous. Merci aussi au public d'avoir assisté, d'avoir posé des questions. Nous n'avons pas pu répondre à toutes les questions, mais on reviendra vers vous par mail pour continuer la discussion. Je dis un grand merci aussi à APV, FVOB et le département de la coopération au développement belge pour leur appui pour cette conférence. Les présentations, les enregistrements seront disponibles sur le site educate.be à partir de la semaine prochaine. Pour vous, le public, n'oubliez pas de vous inscrire pour la conférence du 22 octobre, la semaine prochaine, donc jeudi prochain. Je peux déjà vous annoncer qu'il y aura 3 sessions successives avec des témoignages haut en couleur des 4 coins du monde. Nous nous retrouverons la semaine prochaine. Entre-temps, n'hésitez pas à communiquer via les réseaux sociaux, #Educate2020. Et tout le mot de la fin, n'oubliez pas, prenez soin de vous et prenez soin des autres. Je vous dis merci et à très bientôt.
Merci à tous. Merci.
Okay.